This is the next part of higher biology. We've looked so far at photosynthesis and growing crops, the science behind that, and then we've had a look at selective breeding as well. So, how to maximise, um, the amount of crop available, nutritional values, and so on. And the next part of this is how to. So, first of all, you need to be able to describe the main threats to crop productivity. And to begin with, this is just set up as a little research activity. So what I'd like you to do is choose three of the following. So we've got annual weeds, perennial weeds, slugs, green fly, blight, and soft rot. And then just spend maybe, I don't know, 30 minutes, 3/4 of an hour for each one. Find out what it is, the crop or the crops in particular that it affects. So in terms of human food, how it reduces productivity, and what can be done to reduce its negative effects. So do that and then come back and we'll go through each of them. So hopefully you've been away and you've had done a bit of research into the different threats to crops, and we can divide this into the crop productivity is reduced by we're going to have three sort of different areas. So first of all, you've got competition from this, which is an example of a weed. Secondly, you've got damage, and that is by pests, for example, snails or greenfly or whatever. And then finally, damage by, so that is disease, so potentially fungus or a virus, bacteria. So let's just look at each one in a bit more detail. So annual weeds, first of all, they've got certain characteristics. So they grow rapidly. They've got a short life cycle as well. They produce many seeds, which I suppose the fact that they've got a short life cycle, well, that's kind of the the fact that they produce many seeds kind of means that's not so important in terms of survival of the species, and also long-term seed viability, which means that seeds can hang about, for long periods of time, potentially through the winter, and then they can, once conditions are favourable again, they can germinate. So there's an example there. So chickweed, one of the most common annual weeds in the UK. So perennial weeds is a bit different. So perennial, if we use the word perennial just in terms of, non-plant related topics. So perennial means comes back year after year. So perennial weeds, their characteristics, they have storage organs in their roots, which allows them to live for years. And also they can reproduce without seeds, and this is called vegetative reproduction. So an example is dandelion, and they'll survive through the winter, and you'll know yourself if you've done a bit of weeding in your garden or whatever, if you try to pull dandelions out, it can be quite difficult. You quite often need specialised tools to get in and really remove the roots. And also with dandelions, they'll grow between slabs in your garden, so they don't need an awful lot in terms of nutrients. And you have the flower heads here. If you blow these about, then these are the seeds, so obviously very easy to spread them around. So they're one of the most common perennial weeds in the United Kingdom. So have a look at this. This is quite a long video, but if you just pick out, so if you just Google that, or not Google it, YouTube that, and then if you go to 18 minutes 48 and play it through to 24 minutes, this will talk you through what we've just been looking at. So moving on to our second threat to crop productivity, and that is pests. So these are usually invertebrates. So insects, for example, rose aphid, nematode worms is another one, and also mollusks like snails. And yeah, I didn't mention there, but pests basically they eat your crop, so they're not available to eat for humans. Disease, so invertebrates are again involved, so they're often carried by invertebrates, and you have got fungi, so blight is one of them, which is sort of famous for the potato famine in Ireland, but it's, still occurs. Viruses as well, so there's stunt virus in tomato, and then finally bacteria as well. So this is called crown rot, which you've got here in carrots. And if someone's, particularly in the developing world, if somebody's crop is taken by one of these diseases, then it could mean starvation for the family. So have a look at this. This is again, I did mention this, so flight from famine, and it shows you just how severe these, fungal infection for a crop can be in terms of our kind of local history. The famine in Ireland led to a lot of people leaving the country, and has probably changed world history because you've a lot of people around the world with Irish roots, and a lot of that's come from because these crops were infected with potato blight. So just from what I took you through there, and also some of your own research that you were doing, just to conclude this part, just a little mind map. So just kind of a summary of what each of these means. So why weeds are a problem, what's the difference between perennial and annual, and maybe an example for both, and then similarly for pests and also for disease. And once you've finished, just go back, have a look at your printed notes if you've got them, or digitally, or go back through the video and just see if you've covered the main points for those various threats to crop productivity. So to begin with, let's try this. So describe the differences between annual and perennial weeds. So press pause and do that. So if we separate them, annual weeds, they have rapid growth, short life cycle, produce a lot of seeds. The seeds can last a long time. Whereas the perennial weeds, so they don't have a short life cycle, so they're the opposite. They can live for years, and the reason for that is because they've got storage organs in their roots which allow them to survive. And also, although some of them will produce seeds, they don't necessarily need to, so they can reproduce without seeds, and this is called vegetative reproduction, whereas annual weeds they do produce seeds. So here is a quiz. Let's play What's That Weed? So there's number. Let's see if you can how you get on with this. How's your weed knowledge? So write down the answers for these. So there's number 1. That's number 2. 3 is that. 4 is that. 5, 6, 7, and 8. So what are each of these? So press pause and see if you can do that. So number 1 is something we'll talk about later on in the course when we get on to invasive species. That is Japanese knotweed. Number 2 is dandelion. Number 3, I didn't actually know this one, that's plantain. Number 4, buttercup. 5, probably recognise this, that is called sticky willy, or the more scientific term is cleaver. 6 is clover. 7, nettle, and then 8, the last one here, that is dock. So weeds, perennial weeds, dandelions, pests like slugs, diseases like blight, we know that they reduce crop productivity, so how can they be controlled? So each picture shows a traditional practice which protects crops from weeds, pests or disease. And what are they? So just to lead you into this, I wonder if you can work out what's going on. So what we have here is crop rotation. Why might that be useful in protecting crops from weeds, pests or disease? The second one is ploughing. And the C, these women have got hoes, so they're hoeing. So what does that do? I'll tell you. So the first type of crop protection, this is called cultural. So what you can do is crop rotation, and what that means is if every year you change the crops which are in a particular area, then it means that if you have pests which are specifically feeding in broad beans, then if you change the next year to a different type of crop, then that means that those pests will die out. Okay. So that would be a reason for doing crop rotation and why it protects against pests. Ploughing, so if you're ploughing the land, you're turning it over and it goes fairly deep. And if you're going fairly deep, then that's going to get rid of your perennial weeds. So they're either going to be damaged or they're going to be buried, which means they can't get sunlight, they can't carry out photosynthesis, or and consequently die. The last one, weeding. So if you get in early enough with your hoe, then that means you can remove annual weeds. So annual weeds are quite shallow. So if you can just kind of nip the roots of them, turn them over, bury them in the mud, then that will mean that they won't be able to carry out photosynthesis and they can die. They'll die. So that's what's called cultural crop protection. So these are all methods that have been employed for centuries, in order to reduce that competition or to reduce damage from pests. Things have moved on a bit though, because now we are using chemicals more often. So you can see here, this is, well, it's a wee bit out of date, isn't it? But you can see the uses of various different chemicals. So you've got herbicides in blue, then you've got insecticides, you've got fungicides, and then you've got others. So that might be a combination or other chemicals that apply to crops, maybe fertilizers perhaps in here. Oh no, it's just pesticides, so I'm not sure what that is. So we're going to give you some information on the chemical protection of crops. So I just want you to have a read of it and press pause, have a read of it and see, and then I'll ask you some questions on it. So here's the first paragraph. So it's about herbicides. The second is about pesticides. And then the third is about fungicides. So just press pause, have a couple of minutes reading that, make sure you understand it and what each of the terms means. Okay, and then try and fill that in. So that press pause, numbers 1 to 8, and see if you have got it. So number 1, something herbicides are effective on most weed species. That is systemic, and they're systemic because it means they are absorbed into its vascular system. So the vascular system means the xylem and the phloem. For us, it would, within plants, for us it would mean it was going through our arteries and veins. So they're absorbed into its vascular system and prevent, number 2, regrowth. And then you also have selective herbicides, so they have a greater effect on broad-leaved weeds. Then you have got systemic, number 4 is pesticides, so that's insecticides, molluscicides and nematicides, and they are systemic, so similar to the herbicides, they spread through the vascular system of the plant and kill the pests when they feed on it. Systemic fungicides are 6, absorbed by the plant to protect it. They are more effective if used after diseased forecast but before infection. So if there was, say, in the next field beside you, there was potato blight and there was the chance the fungal spores could move into your field, then you would want to add the systemic fungicide beforehand, so they're most effective before the plant is actually infected as a preventative mechanism. So let's go back to this video we looked at before. So this is the wonder of weeds, and then this section is 1420 to 1820, and I'll talk about chemical control of weeds. I think it might possibly be knotweed. So just a few questions on this section. So try this. Let's press pause. The The list below gives some adaptations of weed plants. Which of these are competitive adaptations of annual weeds? Press pause. So the answer for this is 1 and 4 only. So high seed outputs, this is annual weeds we're talking about, so they produce lots of seeds and the seeds are able to survive a long time, so it's 1 and 4. Try this one, press pause. So the diagram shows a perennial weed found in agricultural land in Scotland. Which feature of this weed indicates that it should be controlled by a systemic herbicide? So it's the fact that it's got storage organs, so you need the herbicide to go all through the vascular system of the plant, so and get down and kill the storage organs as well. So that's C. Time for a break. One more to go after this, and we'll just conclude with a bit of revision of this topic. So to begin with, here's our various methods of chemically controlling our threats to crops. So put down numbers 1 to 4 and match them to the appropriate letter. Press pause. So number 1, systemic herbicides, that is B, effective against most weeds. 2, selective herbicides. Oh, hang on, I should have said there's more than one for each. So 1 is also D, spread through vascular system of plant. 2, selective herbicides, C, most effective against broad-leaved weeds. 3, systemic pesticides, that is spread through vascular system of plant. And then systemic fungicides, they are most effective if applied at disease forecast, so 4A. And also, because they're systemic, spread through the vascular system of the plant. So, you probably will already know if you're using chemicals there can be problems. From National 5 Biology, we talked about the effects of fertilisers and eutrophication, algal bloom and so on. So there are issues with pesticides as well. So describe what they are and also explain what biological control of pests is. So problems with pesticides, what we've got here on the left hand side demonstrates it. So DDT is an insecticide which can be used to kill lice, fleas, greenfly and other insects. So this number here, ppm, means parts per million. So this is a lower concentration, and you can see this is a food chain. As you go up the food chain, the concentration of the insecticide DDT gets higher and higher. So the problem with it is you might be using it to target, to kill whether it's greenfly or something else which are affecting your crop. However, it's going to have an effect on other living things within the food chain, and you can see particularly towards the top of the food chain. So toxic to non-target species. Also, they can be non-biodegradable, so they'll persist in the environment for a long time. So DDT is now banned. And also they accumulate, because they persist in the environment, they accumulate within food chains, and you also have this, they also magnify, so they increase in concentration as you go up in the food chain. So if the eagle here eats the fish and there is insecticide or pesticide within the tissue, then it's going to eat that and it's going to get stored within its tissues. It doesn't break down, so this is just going to continue over and over again, and gradually the concentration builds up. And something else that happened as well is that we looked at natural selection at the end of Unit 1, and you will have this selection pressure. So you will, every time you spray the insecticide, you will have some that will have had a random mutation, which means that they survive. So over time, a bit like with antibiotics, you're going to end up with resistant populations. So the Colorado beetle was an example of one which has become resistant. So bioaccumulation, This is defined as the increase in concentration of a chemical within an organism over time. So this is one of your problems with pesticides, and you can see it here. So what you've got here, this isn't a food chain, this is the same fish, the same fishes going older. And you can see that over time they're eating contaminated food, and it's not breaking down. So as their life goes on, the concentration of the pesticide is increasing, and eventually it's going to reach toxic levels. So that's bioaccumulation, increase in concentration of a chemical within an organism over time. Slightly different is biomagnification. So bioaccumulation is within one organism. Biomagnification is the idea that the concentration of a chemical increases as you go up the food chain. So, as I was mentioned before, when we had a look at the food chain with a bird in it, if you're at the top of the food chain, you're going to eat a lot of food compared to those further down the food chain. If that food is contaminated with a chemical, then you are going to ingest it, and it's going to accumulate within your tissues. So biomagnification is you're looking at a food chain as a whole, and you're talking about it being at the concentration of the chemical being at its highest in the apex predator, or the animal at the top of the food chain. So, affecting humans, this is somewhat scary but worth pointing out. So, in 2016, urine samples were taken from 2,000 Germans, and 99% of samples contained the pesticide glyphosate, which is also known as Roundup. So, routinely sprayed onto crops like wheat. So, obviously, wheat is in all sorts of things that we eat. And yeah, this seems to be in all of our systems. We think whether the concentration of it is enough to do any damage is we're maybe not aware of that yet, but yeah, it's there. So we're not just, when we're talking about pesticide use, we're not just talking about animals in the wild. It's there within us as well. So maybe we need to look at alternatives to pesticides. So here's a YouTube film that discusses that. So you can look for that. So do we really need pesticides? Go and have a watch. So here is one alternative to pesticides. So what you could do is use the natural predator, pathogen, or parasite of a pest to kill it. So, and I've done this actually in my back garden just as a little experiment. I found a ladybird, and I knew there was aphids feeding on, I think it was herbs we had, and you can just add the ladybird and it'll have a fine old time eating the greenfly. So that's biological control. So you add the natural predator, usually, or it could be the pathogen or the parasite of a pest to kill it. So it's a non-chemical method. You have to be careful though, because you don't want it to become an invasive species. So an invasive species is one that does damage to the environment. We'll look at that later on in Unit 3. So if it becomes invasive, an invasive species, or it starts to prey upon or starts to affect other species than the one that you're targeting. So what you might have, in terms of, we might not want to use pesticides, but at the same time we need to feed a growing human population. So what you might want to do is a combination. So a combination is called integrated pest management. So that is when you use these kind of old-fashioned, so you use the cultural methods alongside chemical methods, and you also use biological control. Okay, so various methods used in combination in order to try and maximize productivity. So here is from 2016 an 8-mark question from the exam. Write notes on crop protection under the following headings: weeds, pests and disease, and then part 2, methods of control. So basically what damages the crops and what can be done to reduce the damage caused by them. So press pause and do that. So this is what you should have. So for the first section, you're talking about, first of all, or maybe not first of all, but you should be talking about weeds. So what do they actually do? They compete with the plants. So we've got you could say inter-specific competition if you wanted, but just saying compete suffices. So weeds compete with the plants, which reduces the growth of the crop or reduces crop yield. Then getting into specifics. So first of all, you can talk about annual weeds and just some sort of, you need one characteristic of them, like rapid growth. Or you would get a mark if you talked about perennial weeds, and you need to say that perennial weeds have storage organs or carry out vegetative reproduction. Then what the problem with the pests is, so the way in which they reduce productivity is by eating the plant or damaging it. And you get, if you have two examples, then you also get a mark there. And if you've got everything up to this point, then you've got your 4. Diseases, just an example of an organism which causes a disease, whether it's bacteria, fungi, or viruses. And then you would also get a mark for saying diseases are often spread by invertebrates. So a maximum of 4 for the first part. Then for the second part, so you're kind of splitting it up into cultural, chemical, biological control. So pests or diseases can be controlled by cultural methods, and an example. Then talking about what selective weed killer does, systemic weed killer, you can get 3 just for doing these. And then for the fungicide, you could have mentioned that they are applied based on disease forecasts. Then the other mark over here, so biological control is using a predator, and then talking about issues with these control methods, so you could talk about bioaccumulation and so on, and you would also get a mark for integrated pest management. So just take your time and go through that and see if you can get 8, and if not, just kind of focus on what you missed out on. So just to finish off, bit of revision of the first 3 topics of Unit 3. So we've had photosynthesis and then selective breeding, then we've had crop protection. So try this and then write down a sentence with each word in it. Press pause. So here are the answers. And if you haven't yet written down a sentence for each one, then do that now. Press pause. So herbicide is, you could say it is applied to kill weeds which would compete with crops and reduce their growth. Carotenoid is one of the 3 pigments found in chloroplasts which absorbs light energy. Photolysis is a stage within photosynthesis in which light energy splits water into hydrogen and oxygen. Rubisco is the enzyme which is involved in the carbon fixation stage of photosynthesis. Pigment, now you can combine that with number 2, so the 3 pigments, chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B and carotenoids, absorb light energy at different wavelengths. 6, inbreeding, you could talk about why it's carried out, so in order to produce a generation which have favourable characteristics, but you might also want to mention inbreeding depression, which means that if you have an inbred population, they could accumulate deleterious, harmful alleles. And then number 7, F1 hybrid. So F1 hybrids are often plant species which are produced to have the favourable characteristics of 2 strains. And you might want to say as well that F1 hybrids are usually not bred, so that line is maintained. Perennial weeds are weeds which have storage organs which survive for year after year. Fungicides are used to kill fungi like blight which damage crops, and you could say they're best applied before disease or a disease forecast before the plant's infected. And then bioaccumulation is the increase in concentration of a chemical within one organism. Okay, and it is because the chemical, e.g. the pesticide, is non-biodegradable.